This is NFTCulture. I'm Pio, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. David Lisser. How's it going, David?
Yeah, it's going very well, thank you. Yeah, and having a good day, and it's about to get better.
I think so too. David is an artist with a very original style. We're going to obviously talk all about it. David, before I say any more, why don't you tell the audience, how you might describe your style of artwork? I'd be curious to hear how you describe it.
Yeah, sure. It's probably one of the worst questions to ask an artist. We should be better at describing our own styles, but sometimes we're not. I'll give it a shot. I make work that sort of imagines future scenarios, specifically around food and largely around the idea of cultured meat. And so my work looks slightly futuristic, but it also places it with some heavy emphasis from art history. So you might see kind of still life references or maybe kind of older style paintings. So I kind of like to mix the future and past in these slightly dark, slightly maybe not grotesque, but kind of unnerving scenarios. But I try and get like moments of light and beauty in there as well.
I think that that's a very apt description. So I think that you are good at describing your own work. And, I'm going to pull up some of your work so that people can take a look at it, because I do think it's just so original. We have to kind of do it justice and actually show what it is. I really like your work a lot. And that's not always the case for artists that I interview. I like and I like food a lot, and we're going to talk about food, but I think that the way that you go about this, it's just so refined. I have to imagine that publication, I don't know where work has been featured, but to think that, high-end magazines, publications are very interested in collaborating with you because the work just seems so polished. How long have you been doing this style of work, like this, kind of artistic identity?
Not all that long, to be honest. I've been working with food in my art for the best part of a decade, but I would consider myself in some ways, I trained in sculpture, in physical sculpture, and so I did a lot of metal work and woodwork and casting, those sorts of practices, and I was kind of using that way of working to kind of explore ideas of future foods. And the digital stuff actually, it came out of me essentially trying to learn CAD so that I could work better with fabricators. I was doing a big public sculpture in the north of England, a long kind of like 2-year-long project with quite a few different partners, all kind of wanting things from me. And so, yeah, I learned CAD to be able to supply basically some drawings to some glass manufacturers to see if it was possible. And then the partners wanted to know what's it going to look like. And so I thought, well, I've got the CAD model. I should be able to render this out in some sort of way. And so I started learning, CG really 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and used it for that project. But got totally enthralled into the worlds that you can open up, because you're no longer bound by physical restraint. I mean, most of my work probably looks like it could be physically real. That's my background. That's my sculpture. It's kind of very set in material. But actually, you can do things that just don't exist. So that's probably what really kind of brought me into that. And then, well, you've probably heard this from a few people, but last, COVID hit, and as a self-employed artist, last March in the UK, I lost about 12 months of work just in a week, gone, like nothing. And I was like, shit, this is bad. And so I was kind of, at this point, I was kind of getting okay, not like publishing ready or anything, but okay with digital stuff. And I was thinking, right, well, let's just put time into this. I've suddenly got a lot of time. I don't know what to do with. So it was a slightly kind of panicked foray into just learning everything I could about how to set up lighting, how to make 3D models, how to work with texturing and all of that. And so I've kind of brought a lot of the formalism and the balance from real world sculpture and my background there, and translated them into digital space.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. Like, if I just look at how refined some of these pieces are, it's just very impressive, and it looks like you've been doing it for a lot longer than you have been. So kudos to you. And I think what you said about the COVID situation and how that impacted your work, I've heard from several artists on the interviews that we've done. Siobhan Wong, she was just like fashion photographer, and when you're taking pictures of models and all of a sudden no one can be in the same room together because of a global pandemic, she decided to make her own models, so she got into 3D too. So pretty much an identical situation that you had. And we talk a lot on the interviews that we do here about limitations leading to creative breakthroughs, and there's a lot of instances of this throughout history, and I talk about them in the interviews a lot, so I don't necessarily have to rehash all of them. But if you look at this, right, could you have seen yourself doing digital sculptures of futuristic cured meat 3 years ago? Like, do you think that was going to be in the cards?
It wasn't part of my 3-year plan, I must admit. No. It's quite a niche area.
And so can you talk to me about like why food? Like you're talking about being from like a sculpture background. That totally makes sense to me. Where does the food come into play for you creatively?
It probably comes from a few different angles, really. A lot of it's kind of to do with my childhood. My nana, my dad's mum, was a really big influence in my life growing up, and she was just an incredible cook. But she really enjoyed cooking and made it really look really easy. And so I spent a lot of time in the kitchen at her house, just learning from her. Initially, it's just like, how do I peel this? Can I chop this finely enough? That kind of thing. But it became a real sort of a bonding experience for us. And she's passed away. She died a few years ago. But throughout my kind of from late teens through to now, I'm in my mid-30s, cooking has always been, when I have the time, like almost a form of relaxation for me. It's a time to have this purely creative moment where you can just, you get fairly instant results, and there are structures to work within, but you can push those structures, you can break those boundaries as long as you know the rules in the first place. And obviously there are chefs who can just like turn the rules upside down, and I have admiration for those guys. So food for me is quite an important part of who I am. But I'm also really interested in the sort of environmental and cultural impact of food, the way that we grow our food and the way that we raise livestock, what the effects that has on society, really. Like, it forms the way that societies function, whether they're a kind of agrarian, kind of small farmers, mega farmers, every town's got their own cheesemaker, or there's just a big dairy down the road. Food, technology, and history are like three kind of spirals that intertwine and kind of form up how society works. So I'm very interested in food itself, but more so kind of like the impact of it in a way.
For sure. And, I'm glad that you brought it up. This is actually coincidentally something that I'm very passionate about. I haven't really had an opportunity to talk about this with other interviewers. The other artists aren't doing futuristic cured meat digital sculptures. So, I don't get to go down this rabbit hole. They're lost. Yeah. This is the new mainstream. So, I mentioned you off air. I spent about a month in London in 2019 in the foodie area near Borough Market. And, my parents are from Italy. So I have like the European food history kind of roots. And when I look at Europe, the UK, even, Asian countries, which I visited too, compared to the United States, the big differences that I see is that ancient food traditions, whether it's the actual recipes and dishes or the culture, like you're talking about, like how the animals are raised, how the food is grown, those ancient traditions are largely intact and preserved, and really valued, right? Like if you go to a Southern Italian family home and try to change something about a traditional pasta dish, you're probably going to get kicked out of that home pretty quickly, right? Like
Yeah,
the
exactly. It's like an
the
insult.
tradition. Exactly. The traditions are preserved. You don't see that as much in the United States. You see it with like the Southern United States with their traditions like barbecue and the traditions down there. But as we're a big country over here. On the whole, there isn't that culture, and there's also a really big culture of factory farming. There's a
Yeah.
culture of food that you buy in a bag or a box. Isn't really food when you think about it. It's made in an assembly line with food scientists and ingredients that don't in the ground or come from the planet. So, I'd be curious, like, what are your thoughts on that? Are you seeing anything, going in a particular direction in the UK, like whether for the better or for the, for worse? I would just be curious to hear your perspective on all of those themes.
Yeah. Well, I will also add that I don't think the UK has a particularly great food tradition when you compare it to Italy, for example. Like we can do potatoes and we can do sort of like overboiled vegetables and overcooked meat, but that's we're good at puddings. We can do puddings and desserts. That's maybe it. But to get to your question, the way that things are going here, to be honest, there's almost like a divide amongst class and wealth, and your just what kind of privileges you've had in life, really. In the UK, I see around me, for those who are sort of have the time to be able to be educated in this sort of thing and the money to do it, frankly, there's a lot more interest in where the food comes from, eating seasonally, kind of maybe rediscovering a bit of that heritage. But we have to be quite frank that for a vast amount of society, food is fuel, isn't it? You kind of, you have to work, you work, you get hungry, you eat, you eat to work, rather than, oh no, wait, I'm confusing
You
myself,
work
but you
to
know what I'm
eat,
saying.
yeah.
Yeah. But I think that you can tell quite a lot about a society when you look at their food. If you go back to ancient history, like archaeologists will look at the type of food that a tribe ate and the tools that they used. And with those two, they can build up this incredible picture of what their society was like, and maybe even uncover some of the relations and the societal quirks. And so a lot of my work is kind of flipping that and projecting into the future and thinking, okay, if a society grows their meat like this, or they uses these technologies to make their food, what can we imagine this future society might be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. And to think like that is, I think, pretty uncommon, just when you look at what other artists are doing. I'd be curious, since you started releasing work like this food-based work, have food media companies, whether like magazines, TV shows, or like, chefs of restaurants, have people been reaching out to you with opportunities? Like, has this opened new, interesting doors in the food for you?
Not as much as I'd like, to be quite honest. That might be because I am not very good at pushing my own work, and it's an area that I really need to learn how to do better. I've had, interestingly, some quite good chats with companies who are growing meat in laboratories. There's a couple based in the UK, some more in the Netherlands, and we've kind of, just individual scientists have seen my work either on Twitter or on Instagram, and we've kind of shared a few DMs, the occasional email, and they're quite interested in the way that I'm approaching, their work. But it's a really closely guarded industry at the moment. So there's there's not much in the way of me being able to kind of work directly with them, because they're very much kind of keeping their practices secret. I'd probably have to sign a ream of NDAs to kind of like even be able to go and visit or something like that. It's something that I'm trying to push forward a little bit with, but I haven't had loads of interest, to be quite honest.
Okay. And on that subject that you just brought up, the food scientists growing meat, and that's obviously in line with the work that you're doing. Do you have any thoughts on that, on like, what direction that's going in, and whether that's a good thing, a neutral thing, a bad thing? Like, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do have thoughts, and it's probably the reason that they're not they're not engaging with me directly. No, I think it's a neutral thing. I think, like most technologies, it's how we end up using it. Initially, when I found out about it, I was like really excited, because I knew how bad industrialized livestock farming is for the world. There's a lot of data to show that when you're raising animals in small amounts, kind of organically and with good feed and with like a good amount of land, and as part of a system that's actually like net beneficial for the environment, both at a micro level there and sort of larger. But I think most people who've bothered to kind of look into it know that kind of, cutting down old forests to grow soy to feed 20,000 beef cattle in an area where you're like pumping water from somewhere else to be able to water them, it is not good in terms of environmental impact, and it's not sustainable whatsoever. Makes you a lot of money right now, but you won't be able to do that in 30-40 years time. And so I was looking at this lab-grown meat and the kind of the promises that it made, which is something we can talk about, the difference between promise and reality, but the promises that it made in terms of environmental benefit and also ethical benefit. At full disclosure, I eat meat. I don't eat it very often, but I do. I'm not vegan, but I think in terms of being able to replace aspects of the hugely industrialized sort of meat processing, I felt like lab-grown meat could be a way of addressing some of that. However, what I think it is a kind of a technological solution to a behavioral problem. And what I mean by that is, we, in certain parts of the world, we eat far too much meat and we don't want to pay very much for it, which requires producers, because of big supermarkets and stuff pushing the price down, it requires the producers to basically cut corners or to find more efficient, short-term efficient ways of doing things, which in the long term end up depleting resources. So essentially the problem is us wanting to eat cheap meat all the time. The behavioral solution is to change the way we behave. The technological solution is to try and find a way of producing cheap meat that we can eat all the time. And so I think it's quite an interesting, to be honest, it's a fascinating world for me, which is why I keep on making art about it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's something that a lot of people, I think, don't think about. As I kind of alluded to before, you touched upon a bunch of things that I'm totally on board with, which is that there's no question that factory farming is not a net positive. It's actually just absolutely horrendous. In the United States, we have fast food here. A McDonald's cheeseburger. It's unlikely to me that those cheeseburgers, whatever amount of beef that's actually in that burger, will be sourced from small local farms. So it's definitely a big mess, and that's something that I haven't heard before, right? That there's a behavioral side where we need to either learn how to cook cheaper cuts of meat, or just make adjustments to how much meat we consume and how often we consume it, or make adjustments to how we source our meat. But that I haven't heard it put that way, that there's a technological solution, and that would actually be growing the meat. So that's fascinating, and thank you for that insight. I'd be curious, are there any other artists that think similar to what you're doing?
A couple, not many. And the fascinating thing to me is that this whole, so the first lab-grown piece of meat was grown by artists, not by
Really?
yeah. Some artists, Australian pair called Ionat or Yonat, I don't know quite how to say him, Ionat, Zur, Zurr, and Oren Katz. And they ran a program called Symbiotica, I think, in Australia. And they were kind of investigating what we think of as life, the liveliness of material. And so they grew, I want to say it was frogs' cells, but we might have to think that I've got that wrong. But yeah, they grew they basically, took cellular material and grew meat from it. And they were the first people to do that in late 90s, early 2000s. And then they actually served minuscule steaks up as a sort of like event in a gallery, basically, to mark their opening of their show. And they've done lots of things like this. They kind of made first people to grow leather out cellular leather. That is hard to say. And that was kind of on display during the show with all of its like feeding systems and all the things like that. And so they were approaching it from what is life? Are these things alive? How do you feel about us keeping them alive during this exhibition, and the fact that they will probably, when this exhibition finishes, they will die? You know, is this killing? Is it not? How do we relate to these beings here? And then, so they were kind of operating in their own little world like this. Meantime, people who are doing regenerative medicine, so, you know, kind of growing cellular stuff in the laboratory to be able to kind of aid the growth of implants, or, you know, medical reasons, that technology was beginning to be looked at as a way of producing food. And the big breakthrough, it obviously been going for a few years before this, but the big breakthrough was in 2013 with a Dutch researcher called Mark Post, who did this big, like, he got his PR right. I need to learn from him. But he kind of did a big show where he cooked the first lab-grown burger, and, you know, it got all over the papers because it kind of cost 300,000 euros worth of research. And so, you know, there were all the tabloids and all the papers like, this $300,000
yeah, they love that $300,000 burger. They love
exactly, that. Yeah. And that's kind of like the watershed moment, really, where it began to kind of get into the public consciousness a little bit. And it's still going. But in terms of artists approaching it in the way that I do, I'm not aware of any, and I would love to speak to some if there are.
Okay. And you know, that's so fascinating to think about, like, the ethical concern on, like, you know, growing something in a lab, and then, you know, what do we do with it now? If it dies, is that a death? And, you know, are we responsible for that? And I think that's, again, something that people aren't thinking about, but is going to be a moral issue that comes up as this technology continues to develop. Okay, so I want to get to NFTs at this point. So how did you find out about NFTs, and how has the experience in the NFT space been going for you so far?
Sure. So I would say I came to NFTs relatively late. Obviously, it depends on when you first knew about them, but sort of September or October of 2020. As I say, I was kind of making this digital work, and I was getting to the point where I was like, do you know what? This is okay. This might actually be art. You know, I might be kind of pleased with this. And then I just happened to join one of these like Zoom seminar things through like an arts organization that I'm a part of. And they were having an interview with Metageist. I don't know if you know his work, but he kind of, yeah.
Digital sculptures.
Exactly. Yeah. Working in VR, making VR sculptures, and then kind of presenting them in VR and NFT spaces. And he was talking about all of this, and I was like, what? This is amazing. This stuff exists. You know, because I kind of like, my knowledge of crypto was pretty rubbish. I looked into getting some Bitcoin in like 2013 and decided not to. You know, I'm
Good
sure
decision.
yeah, great decision. Yeah. But apart from kind of vaguely keeping an eye on what it was doing, I didn't know that basically that you could do these kind of things with smart contracts. And so you might have gathered from the way that I'm talking that I'm quite research heavy in the way that I approach stuff. So I spent the next kind of 3 months just learning as much as I could, talking to people. Shout out Metageist if he ever sees this. He welcomes me in, and no question was too daft. He is just a brilliant ambassador for this space and has brought a lot of people into it. So yeah, he's a bit of a kind of flag bearer for me. And yeah, so I spent quite a long time observing, basically, kind of, it took me a long time to actually join Twitter, but I was like watching it and kind of seeing stuff unfold and kind of getting in on Discord and talking to people there. And because basically I can see it from like an art historical point of view because of my background. I'm not a natively digital creator who's been working with commercial clients for years and years. I've come from from the like fine art sort of wing of things, and so I just I can see its trajectory. Well, I think I can, and its history, and I just think it's transformative. It's messy as hell right now, but it's transformative.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And that's so interesting to me that Metageist was a bit of an ambassador to you for the space. You talked earlier about how you think that you need to get better at promoting your work. I think that the NFT space offers artists a unique opportunity to really take ownership of their own brand in a way that maybe wasn't necessarily possible before, just because of the technological advancements that we have now, where, an artist can build a Discord community pretty much overnight. And you kind of see, some artists say what you want about their work, right? But independent of their work, the communities that they've built, the support, and like really the fan clubs and connection that they have with their collectors is a major driving force in their financial success in the space, in their success in getting their names out there. From your perspective, right? Is that something that you're looking at for yourself? Reason I ask is I've talked to some artists that are all about it, right? But then there's also plenty of artists, maybe more artists, that are like, well, I like to create my work, right? And I can totally relate to that. Wanting to create your work and maybe not, be as engaged on social media. And I think that we'll actually see avenues for those artists to partner, even maybe with a brand like ourselves, like a NFTCulture type of thing, where it's a media brand or an artist agency. And as a result, we're able to offer like a management deal to an artist or something like that. I'm not saying that NFTCulture will do that, but brands like ours could do that in the future. From your perspective, how do you look at that side of the space?
I think you're absolutely on the money there. There are artists who are just fantastic at building that sense, building that excitement, that community, and they're just fun to kind of be around, and even like virtually. And then there are other artists who are much more, they're just quieter in nature, and they find that really hard. They see the value in it, but it's really hard work. And I would say that I fall into that latter category better, like more cleanly. I can talk one-on-one, I can talk in small groups, but put me out on a stage or on social media, and I just like, I don't know what to say. I'm like second guessing everything and overthinking, and Twitter in particular doesn't care if you overthink. What you said yesterday doesn't even seem to count today. And I think as the space matures, we will see some some of the kind of mechanisms that you're talking about, and I think they will have some success. It's an interesting point, because we're at this time, right, where we've had this massive like bubble in February to April, and it's almost like if you take those 3 months out, the trajectory makes way more sense. People can argue on the dates, and that's fine. Like, I don't really mind, but like, it's a point where you kind of, there's this big spike, but actually, if you take the spike out and just imagine the line continuing, we are sort of slowly picking up momentum, and we're gonna have to, as a community, make decisions about what sort of models we bring forward next. What you described there could be quite close to, in the traditional art world, when you work with a commercial gallery, and an artist essentially will be like more or less left to their own devices, but like, wheeled out to go and talk to collectors, or like do, like talks or events or things like that. But the actual, like, this, the day-to-day graft of selling, and kind of, I don't mean selling in terms of transactions, but like selling a brand, is left to agents and the galleries, and that's a good thing, but also like not always, it's not the best thing, because it could be that a lot of, it works a lot through nepotism. Big galleries will maybe only work with artists that they like or that they know already. If you're a small artist, you're never really going to get a chance to kind of show your work in front of them unless you win some sort of competition or happen to talk to the right person at a gallery opening or something like that. So there's opportunity for that sort of mechanism to work, but I think we have to be careful that we're not replicating old world structures that are to some extent flawed in this new space.
For sure. And that's, a very good observation, right? Is that we don't want the new space to be identical to the old space, where there are gatekeepers and there's people that you need to know to be able to get involved. And, I don't want to say that the space is trending that way. I think the big equalizer is the internet, and the fact that you can post your work on, say Hen or Foundation, or, any of these platforms, Rarible, and the cream does rise to the top, right? Like, if your work is incredibly good, you'll gain a following, and it might take longer than if you know the right person, right? But at the end of the day, you can get there. So yeah, thank you for your insight on that. I would like to know what you think about selling the intellectual property of your NFT in the sale as well, which is something that we're starting to see. We see it with some artists, but we see it more in the collectibles market. And I wouldn't be surprised if from the collectibles market, it spills over into the fine art market of NFTs quite a bit as well. For people that are listening that don't have an example of this, for example, there's an artist that sold an NFT, a collector that I know bought the NFT. That collector is writing a book. The artist sold the intellectual property of the NFT with the sale. So now that collector has bought the NFT, he could use that image, that, fine art NFT, as the cover of his book, right? So this is a very interesting new play on NFTs that I think a lot of people, when they first hear it, they're like, well, yeah, so what? You own the intellectual property. Why is that a big deal? And they don't realize, like, well, when Lady Gaga puts out an NFT of one of her songs, it's a one-of-one auction. It's a new song no one's heard, and you own the intellectual property of that song. That's a really big deal. So when I look at your work, I feel like if you sold the intellectual property, a food magazine or a food author, someone that's looking for really interesting images and wants to actually use them for their own work, would probably find your work attractive. So is this something you thought about? And is this something that you have an opinion on?
It's probably something I need to learn a little bit more about, and so I'll ask you a few questions if that's okay.
Sure, I'll come back. Here we go.
Yeah. So, is that the same as copyright? And if so, does that mean that, say I sold the intellectual property of an NFT and a food magazine used it. And then it sort of became a very well-known piece for some reason or another and ended up in different spheres. Would I, as an artist, as the original artist, see any remuneration from that? Or would that entirely, have I just transferred everything over to the person that I sold it to?
So I think, and I'm not an expert on this particular, subject, and I think, very few people are, because obviously it's like the mixture of copywriting and blockchain and technology and smart contracts. But my understanding is, when you sell the IP, the play there is that you'll be able to make more money off of that initial sale because you're selling more than just the NFT, right? Like, say you did a one of one, you'll be able to generate a larger sale. And then the owner has the IP for it, the intellectual property. I do think you could still make it so that if that NFT changes hands, then you would still get your royalty, which is, built into NFT technology as well. With regards to the idea of it spreading beyond that one owner, I think it would be written into the smart contract that the current owner of the NFT has the intellectual property. And if they sell it, then that would get transferred. So I think the idea is, like, let's say a food magazine took one of your cured meat pieces and they wanted to publish a book. As long as they're selling that book, they'd have to own the NFT to maintain that intellectual property. But that's a really good question, and it's complicated, So I think a lot of lawyers are going to be working on that over the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that comes to mind, I won't be able to quote the exact law, but currently, if an artist sells a work in, physical space and in digital space, in most countries, they maintain, I think it's called like the inalienable right to kind of essentially protect their reputation. So even if they've sold it and then that's been sold and sold and sold and sold and sold, and so there's kind of like, let's say there's been 20 transactions, like it's so far removed from the original artist. If that 20th person then decides to use, and I think we've seen it with music actually in political spheres, if they decide to use their music or their art as for reasons that the original artist does not want, be it political, be it ethical, be it moral, for example, I'm fairly sure both in the UK and in the US there have been artists trying to stop certain politicians using their music at rallies. And I think that is only held in law because the artist still maintains the original copyright. So I would not want to lose that. Because an artist, essentially, you trade on your reputation. Yes, you trade on what you're producing at any given point in time. But to be quite honest, if your reputation is good enough, you can like switch completely, make something entirely new, and aesthetically, it could be not that good, or it could be like, just a complete divergence from what you've been doing before. But the reputation holds the work. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether individual artists want to trade the potential of future reputation damage for short-term significant cash gains. And then this might change because we've got so many like anon artists, like that's, and then the idea of reputation of being anon as well. Banksy, I suppose, has been a forerunner for that. Interesting questions. I'm not sure where I sit on it.
It's complex, and the way you're framing it, I totally understand how you're framing it that way, and I do think you're right. Because think about it, like a musician doesn't sell the intellectual property; they license the copyright, they license the intellectual property, and you can take that away, right? You don't have to give me the license to your song, even though like I asked to pay for it. Like it is still the artist's decision. The other way to look at it, right, is that if an artist says like I sold the intellectual property, which is a feature of NFTs, and I made that NFT with the intention of doing that, I'm washing my hands with it. That buyer bought it. and I accepted that transaction, and then they're free to do whatever they want with it. It's almost like a free speech play at that point. So you could also look at it that way, that the artist is like a freedom fighter or something. So it's incredibly complex. It's
Yeah.
one of the yeah, it's one of the many ways that NFTs have revolutionized art and media at this point. So we'll have to see how it plays out. One topic I want to talk to you about, because you seem like you research everything, right? And you're so environmentally conscious. Have you done research on this narrative that blockchain-based technology, from Bitcoin to any blockchain like proof of work technology, is harmful for the environment? And if so, what is your take on that?
Yes, I have done research on that, and I'll put my hands up and say that I can't really quantify it that accurately, and my understanding is that not many people can. Obviously, we had, what was it, late February, early March, all of the kind of like that website that came up and it showed you like your CO2 footprint of your ETH wallet. And so I've looked into it quite a bit, and my fundamental common understanding is, with Ethereum in particular, is how each block is sort of like ordered. What I mean is that the articles that I read, which were kind of anti, and let's be clear, most of the ones that really did the rounds were kind of more opinion articles, rather than the kind of like, they were citing facts rather than an objective peer-reviewed sort of analysis. The ones that I read, and specifically, weirdly, they did the round in like UK artist Instagram feed. It might not have featured like quite as heavily elsewhere, but they were sort of imagining that if you mint a piece, then you are sort of responsible for that block coming forward, and that block wouldn't have been mined or processed if you hadn't minted the piece. Whereas almost like you call a taxi, and the taxi is, if you hadn't called that taxi, that Uber, it would have not driven there if you hadn't done. Whereas my understanding, perhaps flawed, is that when you mint a piece, the reason you pay gas is to basically join a queue. So it's a little bit more like getting a bus, in that like the bus is running anyway, it's going this route, and you pay to get on it, and you pay a higher fee if you want to get on it first. Arguably, if the bus route was, no one used it, then the bus route would cease to exist, i.e. the block would stop being mined. But at the time of reading and the time of researching this, I think NFTs were accounting for like 2 to 3% of the Ethereum network. It may have gone up since then and then probably back down. But from my point of view, I could sort of justify it to myself in the sense that it was kind of running anyway. And also the fact that I don't mint very much. Partly just the way that I work, quite slowly. And then also you have to compare, and you have to make balances and kind of like ideas in life about what you're willing to spend. And I don't mean in the monetary sense. So, I said earlier, like I was making a big public sculpture out of glass and steel. Neither of those are light materials, ecologically speaking. I have done some concrete casting. That's not a light material either. I've done resins, which are petrochemicals. And you have to kind of make your own decision about what you're willing to push forward with. Having said that, I have dabbled a little bit anonymously on Hen, and actually from very early, because I was so intrigued by it. I remember seeing a tweet from Mario Klingerman, Quasimodo, basically when it started, and I kind of joined about a week later and started pushing things out there. essentially because I think it's one of those ones where if you show that people want to use this, then hopefully everyone who's kind of putting money behind it and developing it will kind of speed up in a way. So I'm still probably like Ethereum, what's the word? Weighted. I'm not a maxi, but like just from looking at how well supported it is, what you can do with it, and kind of imagining the future timescale of it, I think it will be around for a fairly long time. I'm going off topic here, but yeah, so I've done a plenty of research. I stopped minting for like a month, looked into all of the whys and wherefores, and kind of came up with my own decision, which is mine, I suppose, and people can criticize me for it, and that's fine.
Yeah, well, I think that you were very reasonable in the way that you approached the research. I think that a lot of times people get swallowed up by the narrative. I don't feel it's necessary that I go on record now to talk about how I feel about the research and the reality of the situation. I've done it on other streams. I would just encourage anyone that's watching this to do research. That isn't just like clickbait articles with headlines to get a lot of attention, but the real research, and then also look into the past too, and look into the narratives that came before the internet, like the narratives about the internet before the internet was mainstream. And I think that that'll, kind of reveal a lot of info. So, all right, David, so we've gone for almost 45 minutes here. I want to give you a chance to plug upcoming work. So, what work is coming down the pipe for David Lisser? Where can people find you? Let's talk about the work that's coming out now.
Sure. Well, I joined Super Rare in early May, which for me,
congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, it felt like a nice kind of validation in a way, because I'm not the highest selling artist really, but I felt like that was a kind of just like a little like seal of approval in a way, and I kind of held back on what I was going to do there because I wanted to make it really special. And so the first piece is up there now. And it's basically the whole of my Super Rare sort of collection will be one story told through NFTs. And it's a sort of pseudo-speculative investigation of lab-grown meat. And it's I'm kind of making up a sort of a hidden history for it. But what I'm doing is that I'm starting with one piece, and I'm treating every individual NFT as a piece of evidence to be kind of looked at by, in a court or by someone investigating it, a detective. And so every NFT is like a little kind of, it's a fragment. It's like putting together a little museum. When you're, as I said earlier, when you're trying to understand a culture, you look at all these artifacts and you try and piece together, okay, what was this used for? Why is this? And what I'm doing with this, so this piece on screen at the moment, the fat thing, is like the first piece of evidence. And within it are actually hidden a number of potential future NFTs, future images, future pieces of artwork. So whoever collects this will be presented with a number of choices to make about which next piece of evidence to commit to chain. So they'll be given the image or the video, and they'll also be given the written narrative that is the accompanying sort of like a blurb. So the collector essentially helps to decide the trajectory of the story, of the investigation, and ultimately gets to, in some way, direct its conclusion.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you're definitely learning about drop mechanics and implementing some really cool stuff with your work. So I'm sure whoever gets that will be very happy with their purchase. Thanks so much for joining us, David. So if we look, you can follow David on Twitter. That's at David Lisser. Definitely follow him on Instagram. There's a link tree on his Twitter, so you can find everything. Congratulations on Super Rare again, and thanks so much for joining us, David.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for the time. It's been great to talk to you.
Likewise. Catch you next time.